The Sempron 145, a low-end office-class processor for the AM3 socket, launched 12 years ago now in September 2010. It had only one core running at 2.8 GHz, and this was in a time where single-core processors were near their end. Launching at $95 or around $130 today, the Sempron 145 was mainly aimed at low-end computers for use with office-type tasks, although for many it would have been at the heart of the gaming PC as well, and for some it may still be. Diving deeper into the specs, and we find 234 million transistors, built on the 45nm fabrication process, including 128 kilobytes of L1 cache and 1 megabyte of L2, which interestingly is double that of the per core amount of cache in the Ryzen 5800 on my personal system. Not that that means it performs anywhere close though, obviously. We also have support for DDR3 memory up to a speed of 1333 megatransfers per second. But the most interesting point of the Sempron 145 for me is that while it's sold as a single core processor, it actually has a second core there. It's just been disabled from the factory. I have some footage of it here, but a single option in the motherboard's BIOS allowed me to unlock the second core. Now, there was no guarantee that that second core would be stable, but I was able to boot into Windows, and running a 10-minute stress test with OCCT confirmed that it was in fact stable. So yeah, if you were lucky enough to own this particular processor before I had it, then you basically got a dual-core processor for the price of the single-core processor you bought. The rest of the system I'm going to be using for the tests today is on screen now, so you can pause the video if you would like a better look at that. But for today, seeing as I was able to unlock the second core in the 145, I'm going to be comparing the performance between the 145 in its single-core state to the exact same 145 in its dual-core state, and having a look at just how much more power the 145 pulls with an extra core. So that should be quite interesting. So I'll be doing some gaming and non-gaming benchmarks, but for now let's get into the first benchmark. I'm looking at a couple of non-gaming benchmarks first, so if you prefer to just see the gaming benchmarks, feel free to skip ahead a little bit. First up though is Cinebench R20, a benchmark focused on showcasing the rendering performance of a processor. It's based on technology that's actually used in the real world, but I think Blender is more widely used for rendering. However, most people watching these kinds of videos are going to be more familiar with Cinebench. That aside, with the unlocked Sempron 145's second core there to help out, it pulls ahead massively over the single core. I wasn't quite expecting the performance to increase just this much, but with two cores, the 145 scores 102.7% higher than with just one, at 302 points versus 149, and it doesn't even use much more power either. The single core on its own pulled 28.06 watts, plus minus 3%, versus only 11 watts more for the unlocked 145 at 38.95 watts. So that's only 38.8% more power for over 100% more performance. Not bad. Most people watching these kinds of videos are probably familiar with 7-zip, which is used in compressing and decompressing zip files, etc. It has its own built-in benchmark to measure compression and decompression performance, which is quite a useful thing to show, as compressing and decompressing files is something most people do with their PC. The score gets measured in MIPS, or millions of instructions per second, with a higher score meaning better performance. And if you're expecting a doubling in score from adding a second, equal core, like what happened with Cinebench, then you'd be right. With two cores, the Sempron 145 manages 6,227.67 MIPS for compression, 9,236 MIPS for decompression, versus 3,025.33 and 4,617 MIPS respectively with only one core, increases of 106 and 100% respectively. To put that into perspective though, a modern high-end processor like the Ryzen 5800 in my personal system scores triple that of the Sempron 145's single-core score at 8,768 MIPS, with only one core enabled itself, and more than double the 145's decompression score at 9,953 MIPS. That is with Windows 10 though, in a different system running a lot more in the background, So it's not directly comparable, but I was actually quite surprised how relatively close the 145 was given its age, and near 2 GHz deficit in frequency compared to my 5800. I've gotten really into BeamNG Drive lately, so I thought it would be fun seeing if it would run on the 145. I used 1080p with the lowest possible settings, and basically just drove around for about half an hour or so on a few of the maps to get an idea of how it performs. And it does run, but it really doesn't run well on a single core, nor does it on two cores either for that matter, but unlocking the second core did improve performance quite noticeably though. Straight up, with only one core, the 145 can only manage average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 11.6, 3.5 and 1.9 FPS respectively, versus 22.1, 12.4 and 8 FPS with its second core unlocked. Generally, the problems were quite noticeable stuttering throughout the maps I tested, although places like Utah, for example, tend to run a bit better. With only one core, the 145 could never really get over 10 to 15-ish FPS at best, and at worst, FPS was in the single figures in and around areas with buildings on the Jungle Rock Island map. The second core does manage to improve on average frame rate overall, with FPS usually around the 20 FPS mark. Stutter could still be quite bad at times, and in general was still quite noticeable throughout, although the improvement of a second core was quite visibly noticeable, and not just in the benchmark figures. The original version of Crysis, which saw its release back in 2007, actually runs far better than expected on just one core. The game generally runs reasonably well overall on one core at 1080p with the lowest settings, but it will struggle in the most intense scenes where FPS can dip as low as the low 30s, or even as low as 20 around massive explosions. You'll also notice stuttering and hitches at points throughout the game too. The second core improves on that massively, where it actually runs quite smooth for the most part away from those intense scenes. But even then, performance doesn't dip that hard. At worst, FPS will only dip to the high 30s in and around big explosions, and around 40-ish FPS in intense fighting elsewhere. With two cores, the Sempron 145 even manages to maintain over 60 FPS for the most part, and with 74.7, 34.2 and 13.1 FPS for average 1% and 0.1% lows respectively, versus the single core's 46.6, 18.1 and 7.6 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% lows. You can see how much more performance is just sitting there within the single core Sempron. Saying its original release back in 2012, CSGO is still one of the most played games today, and it runs both way better and worse than is expected at 1080p with the lowest settings. Way better in that on a single core, later maps such as Mirage and Dust 2 actually run well enough to be playable, except maybe in the first round on Mirage, where performance can get pretty choppy in that initial close combat. It can still be noticeably stuttery throughout, but manages to remain at least playable. Harder to run maps like Anubis and Ancient, for example, are pretty much a no-go, with FPS constantly around the 10 FPS mark, and with noticeable slowdowns in gameplay as well. But it can also run worse than I thought it would, in that with the unlocked second core, performance overall hadn't actually improved that much at all. Average 1% and 0.1% lows of 28.2, 7.8 and 4.8 FPS respectively for the single core, and 39.3, 16.5 and 6.1 FPS for the unlocked Sempron show this. I had noticed a bug with the Sempron after I unlocked it, where sometimes the frequency on the second core can get stuck at around 800 MHz. A reboot normally fixes that, but this could explain performance not being that different. But I was already done with testing before I realised that that might have been what actually happened here. That said, there are still some noticeable improvements in the later to run maps. Mirage, outside of the choppiness you still see in the first round, actually runs reasonably well with very little stuttering, while Dust 2 can still stutter quite noticeably and dip to around 20 FPS in the most intense moments. So overall, not much of a change. Which is the complete opposite of what happened in Skyrim, where the second core makes a really big difference. Performance wasn't great on one core as standard, so I decided to use the ultra low graphics tool to reduce settings even further than the lowest they can normally go, using 1080p for the resolution. This can noticeably improve performance on low-end systems at the expense of a significant reduction in graphical quality. It is still relatively playable on a single core, but it can still be a little bit stuttery at best, to quite noticeably stuttery at worst, like on the run towards Riverwood near the start of the game. 2 cores improves performance quite noticeably here, with only a few minor hitches remaining. Performance can dip as low as around high 30s at points in Bleak Falls Temple, with some light stuttering, but the second core again reduces this to only a few minor hitches, with pretty much no dips in FPS at all. Further away from any buildings or built up villages though, the single core 145 offers relatively good performance, but even here the unlocked Sempron has a noticeable advantage, and with average 1% and 0.1% lows of 51.5, 9.2 and 1.9 FPS respectively, 59.8, 33.2 and 9.1 FPS with 2 cores, you can see just how big the gap in performance can be. So to conclude, I do want to mention that not all Sempron 145s will actually be able to unlock, because there's 2 reasons AMD disabled that second core. First one being that sometimes the lower end part, Sempron in this case, was at a higher market demand than the Athlon 2 that it was cut down from. So they disabled that second core so they can sell it as that single core part. Second reason AMD disable cores is because one of the Athlon 2 that this Sempron 145 should have been, one of that Athlon's cores was faulty. So they disable that core and then sell it as a lower end part so they can recoup some of that money that went into that dual core part originally. I just got lucky that the second core wasn't disabled because it was faulty. So anyone else who has a 145, your mileage is definitely going to vary. You might not have one that will actually unlock. But that said, if you are able to unlock the second core in the 145, the performance difference is huge in general, except for maybe CSGO, although there may have been a problem there, but yeah, CSGO is kind of the exception there. The rest of the tests, the performance difference was huge, and it's not like it pulls much more power either. The power draw only went up by just under 40% at full load, which may seem like quite a big increase, but you need to keep in mind that with how little power the Sempron 145 pulled with just one core, about 28 watts if I remember right, another 40% is only about 11 watts, so that's basically nothing. You won't need any higher or any better cooling or anything like that. So if your motherboard has the core unlocking option and you'd like a bit more performance, then you may as well at least see if the second core will actually unlock. But yeah, that'll be it for the video today. So to finish off, I'd like to thank Patreon supporters Shadow in the Void and Matt Sterak, including all the other patrons you're seeing on screen right about now. If you've enjoyed the video today, I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more content like this. And there'll be various links down below if you'd like to support me in creating these videos as well. But yeah, that'll be it for now. So hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Alright.